Bran Stark could feel the ice in his veins, not just the numbness from the frigid air, nor the tingling in his fingertips whenever the cold wind swept through Winterfell's walls. This was a deeper chill, one that crawled behind his eyes and took root in the center of his chest, a presence both intimate and terrifying. He was the three-eyed raven now. He was supposed to be beyond fear, beyond all mortal considerations of life and death. And yet, there was fear coursing through him as he sat in his weirwood-borne wheelchair beneath the twisted canopy of the heart tree. A breeze stirred the ancient red leaves overhead, and somewhere in that swirl of swirling rust color and falling snow, he heard a soft voice, a whisper that reached across the void between realms. He had been meditating, the way he often did, letting the myriad visions swirl behind his closed lids. Sometimes, in the quiet hush of early morning, he glimpsed the birth of dragons in a faraway land or the forging of a Valyrian steel blade centuries ago. Sometimes, he saw fleeting images from countless perspectives. Ravens in flight, direwolves prowling beneath starlit skies, men at war, swords clanging, hearts breaking, illusions shattered. And then, as the darkness behind his eyelids gave way to shapes and flickers of light, he saw the figure, tall, inhumanly pale, with eyes the color of ice. The Night King stood within his vision, his silent presence demanding a kind of horrifying awe. Time seemed to freeze. This was no mere memory of their previous encounters on the battlefield. This was something else. The Night King's lips did not move, yet Bran sensed the cold words echo in his mind. He felt them as if they were etched into the marrow of his bones. You do not have to fight me. Join me. Become what you were meant to be, an ancient power acknowledging another. The message was not an overt threat, nor exactly an invitation in the normal sense. It was, in some strange and dreadful way, an inevitability. Bran had been the three-eyed raven for some time, but never before did he feel that destiny was a path he might choose rather than simply endure. And on this day, confronted by the cold logic that the Night King emanated, life and death locked in an endless cycle, Bran felt the foundation of his beliefs shift. He told himself that it was impossible. He was Bran Stark, son of Ned Stark, once a boy who climbed walls with boundless energy. He had walked again in his dreams, soared as a raven. He had known heartbreak and tragedy and fleeting joys, but he was also the three-eyed raven, the embodiment of memories stretching back into the darkest recesses of ancient times. Could it be that there was a place in that tapestry where he would stand at the side of the Night King, not as an enemy, but as something akin to an equal? A shrill gust of wind broke Bran's concentration. He opened his eyes, feeling his heart thunder in his ears. The courtyard was almost empty at this early hour, with only a solitary figure or two darting about. He shivered under the thick cloak around his shoulders. The weirwood's face, carved centuries ago, seemed to stare at him as though waiting for his choice, a choice that no living man could safely fathom. He exhaled, shaking with conflicting thoughts. He remembered the last time the Night King's army had marched upon Winterfell. The sacrifices, the terror, the fleeting hope of dawn's respite. Arya's triumphant stroke of the Valyrian steel dagger. The shards of ice that once formed the Night King's body scattering to the winds. The roars of wights as they collapsed into inanimate husks. The near destruction of all they held dear. Yet, as the three-eyed raven, Bran had a deeper perspective. He had seen that time was a loop in many respects. Death had a way of returning, unstoppable, wearing a new face or sometimes the same. In the swirling tapestry of possibility, there were threads in which the darkness never ended. And through the intangible connection that fused him to the realm's mystical energies, he sensed the Night King was not truly vanquished, or that if he was, something of equal malevolence lurked, waiting for the right moment to resurrect that glacial threat. The wheels of the universe never ceased turning. Day always succumbed to night. For days he wrestled with the vision. He said nothing to those around him. Jon had left north again, wandering beyond the wall with the free folk to find a fresh start or to fulfill some sense of penance. Sansa was Lady of Winterfell, her stewardship of the North strong and unwavering, her presence a beacon of stability in those uncertain times of reconstruction. Arya was sailing west of Westeros, chasing the horizon, and Bran, though king of the Six Kingdoms in name after the war ended, found that his role as the three-eyed raven overshadowed any notion of a conventional monarchy. He had relinquished the seat of power to a small council that worked under his occasional guidance. Most believed him to be some quiet, wise figure who rarely spoke. In truth, he roamed the realm of visions far more than he walked the halls of King's Landing. Now, at Winterfell, drawn by an intuitive sense of something old reawakening, he found the heart tree once again calling to him. Or rather, the being behind the whisper was calling. The night he made the decision was colder than any Winterfell had experienced since the Great War. The wind howled like a chorus of specters, and the sky was starless, an endless black velvet canopy offering no comfort. Bran sat upright in his bed, eyes unfocused, breath turning to faint wisps of white in the darkness. And in that hush, he heard the Night King's voice again, not with his ears, but in his mind. The wind battered at the shutters as if urging him to open them, to see something stirring in the moonless night. The voice said little, only that the time had come. Bran's heart pounded. He knew that these were not illusions nor the random echoes of memory. He, in his myriad visions, recognized that the cosmic cycle was pivoting. The dead, or that primal force that commanded them, reached out, bridging the gap between the once living and that liminal domain in which Bran's consciousness traveled. Did the Night King truly have an offer? Or was it all a trick, a final gasp of the darkness trying to worm its way back into the living world? The next morning, Bran told no one of what he intended to do. He asked for the gates to be opened, asked for his horse to be prepared for travel north. Once, the notion of traveling beyond the wall had been nearly unthinkable for him. As a boy, he had looked at the south as a place of wonders and the north beyond the wall as a realm of nightmares. But as the three-eyed raven, fear no longer held him in the same way. Still, to say his companions were surprised by his request would be an understatement. Ser Davos, who had come to Winterfell on a diplomatic errand, tried to gently dissuade him. "Your Grace," he said, hesitating to use the formal title that so rarely passed his lips for Bran. "The land beyond the wall isn't safe. Remember what was there before, the things we faced. We can't be sure it's truly gone." Bran gazed at him with distant eyes, neither warm nor cold, just an impassive acceptance. "There is something I must see," he replied, voice calm. "I'll be safe. This is my path." Sansa confronted him on the ramparts as he prepared to leave. She was, for a moment, the older sister who had once teased him gently about his dreams, who had scolded him for climbing too high. "Bran," she said, eyes full of concern, "tell me why. I understand you better than most, but even I don't always know what you see. Don't do this alone." She placed a hand on his. "Let me send some of our best soldiers with you." Bran shook his head. He felt a pang of affection for Sansa, for her unwavering sense of duty to protect their family. But he also sensed that if he brought others, they would not survive what lay ahead. "I have to go alone," he murmured. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but this isn't something mortal men can face. The three-eyed raven alone must do this." She wanted to insist, but something in his gaze, a quiet, inevitable resolve, made her stop. That evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple and the first specks of snow drifted gently on Winterfell's courtyards, Bran left. He rode slowly, an unsettling figure in the gloom. He had a small retinue of guards who accompanied him past the outer gates, but a league from Winterfell, he calmly bid them return. Only a single direwolf shadowed him. Ghost, the white-furred companion once belonging to Jon Snow, who, after Jon departed north again, had found his way back to Winterfell. Perhaps sensing something in Bran's essence, Ghost silently decided to stay with him, padding through the snow with footfalls that left barely a sound. The journey was long. Each night, Bran's dreams grew more vivid. He saw swirling blizzards that devoured entire forests. He saw frozen rivers like mirrored roads, and upon them marched legions of ice-wreathed figures. He saw a man's face locked in eternal rictus, skin turned blue, eyes shining with eerie luminescence. He saw a white raven with eyes as black as obsidian calling him onward. And always, just at the edge of vision, stood the Night King. Silent, arms stretched wide, as if welcoming Bran into an embrace. The cold air seemed to intensify with each step north, the snow deepening, the trees becoming sparse. The ancient presence of the weirwoods lingered, though, and Bran felt them watch him, as if urging caution, or perhaps marveling at the confrontation that was to come. By the time he reached the base of the colossal wall, Bran could see that it was largely intact. Gaps in the eastern portion had been repaired with both conventional stonework and heavier, archaic magic gleaned from the scattered remnants of old spells. Castle Black was nearly deserted. Only a handful of the Night's Watch remained, those who had not yet accepted that their old vows were largely obsolete now that peace had, supposedly, settled. They saw Bran Stark approach on horseback, recognized him as the young king who had reigned for a few short years before passing the daily governance to others, and bowed. One tried to offer him a place to stay for the night. "There's no place warmer than a bed by the fire, your grace," he insisted. "The storms beyond are fierce." But Bran declined. He simply passed by, never once raising his voice. Ghost followed behind, the direwolf's red eyes glowing in the gathering dusk. No one dared stop him, for something in the cast of his pale face and the faint reflection of starlight in his open eyes told them this was a man beyond ordinary mortal concerns. Crossing through the wall felt like stepping through a portal to another world. Immediately, the temperature plummeted. Bran inhaled and watched his breath crystallize in front of him. Ghost let out a low whine. The ground ahead was covered in thick, undisturbed snow, as though no living thing had ventured this way in a long time. Bran pressed on. It was a slow, arduous journey, but the horse was sturdy, used to northern climes, and Bran felt an unearthly strength guiding him. His mind wandered in and out of visions, fleeting glimpses of 1,000 pasts, 1,000 futures. Even so, he felt a single thread pulling him forward to one inevitable point in time. He camped briefly at night, though camping was little more than forming a small ring of stones and lighting a fire that crackled in the starless dark. He would close his eyes and slip into the skin of Ghost, allowing the direwolf's heightened senses to scout the territory. He felt the hush of the forest, the presence of ravens perched on frost-laden branches, the stirring of some half-buried creatures that had learned to survive in the eternal freeze. Occasionally, he sensed something else out there, a whisper of a consciousness, not living, not dead, a swirl of white flakes dancing through the trees, a memory of what had once been an army of the dead. On the 5th night, a storm beset him. The wind roared like a wounded beast, the snow whirled in vicious eddies, and the sky wept ice so thick that the horse balked. Bran found shelter under a rocky overhang, pulling a thick fur over his body. Ghost huddled close, body heat providing the only warmth. Bran tried to slip into a vision, to see a path away from the storm, but the swirling chaos of the world outside was reflected in his mind. He glimpsed a corridor of blue flame, a swirling black sky shot through with lightning, and in that chaos, the figure of the Night King. He was so close that Bran felt he could reach out and touch him. In that moment, the voice returned, not as a shriek but as a quiet, calm presence that shimmered like cold starlight. "You understand, don't you? The realm of man cannot hold back the tide forever. You know the truth of the long night. I have seen all that you've seen, child of destiny." Bran awoke trembling, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of the power he sensed now entangling itself with his own. Once the storm subsided, he pressed on. By the time he realized where he was heading, dawn was breaking over a landscape of sparkling white dunes. At the center of that icy desert was the place where the Night King had once been created, where the children of the forest had driven dragonglass into the heart of a mortal man, transforming him into a creature of cold immortality. Bran had come full circle to the wellspring of his adversary's existence. A weirwood tree, twisted and pale, stood by an icy pond. The bark glistened under the weak sunlight, and the carved face, if there ever was one, had eroded with time, leaving behind only hollow impressions that looked suspiciously like empty eye sockets. Bran's horse came to a stop of its own accord. Ghost's hackles rose. The dire wolf let out a low rumbling growl. There, at the far edge of the pond, stood the Night King. He appeared just as Bran remembered. Impossibly tall, hairless, skin as pale and rigid as carved bone, clad in a strange armor of black ice. His eyes burned like twin sapphires in the gloom. Behind him, towering pines covered in hoarfrost stood silent, as if bowing to their sovereign. He lifted a single hand in a gesture of greeting or command. No living man would dare approach him. But Bran was something else now. He was not only Bran Stark, but a being who carried within him the spirits of old magic, the living history of Westeros. And if the Night King sensed any fear, he showed no sign of it. Bran urged his horse forward until they reached the edge of the pond. Thin ice groaned underfoot, a treacherous invitation. He slid off the horse with surprising ease for one who had been paralyzed from the waist down. But in the presence of such potent magic, it seemed that physical limitations shifted. He let his legs dangle, almost testing them. The Night King watched silently. Ghost bristled, baring teeth, a low snarl rattling in his throat. "Stop," Bran whispered to Ghost. Though he did not turn to look at the direwolf, he didn't raise his voice. His words carried a quiet authority, and Ghost halted, uncertain, a faint whine escaping him. Then Bran looked up at the Night King, who stood across the frozen water like a statue of living ice. He spoke, though his lips didn't move in a way that a mortal's would. Bran heard the words in his head, an echo in the hush. "You've come. I knew you would. The cycle demands it." Bran gazed at him, the swirling illusions of the future coursing through his mind. He saw cities burned to ash by dragons, armies clashing, lords and ladies playing at their games, short-lived alliances, betrayals, winters that came and went. And above all, he saw the creeping inevitability of death, of time wearing down all mortal ambition. Here was an avatar of that inevitability. The Night King was winter, was death, was the unstoppable end. And yet, in some bizarre reversal, he was also a creation of those who once wished to protect themselves. A tool that had outgrown its makers. Bran found his voice, quiet as it was, drifting in the icy air. "Why call me here? You were defeated. I saw you shatter." His voice trembled slightly, but was bolstered by the ancient knowledge coiled within him. The Night King stepped onto the pond. The ice neither cracked nor protested, as if it recognized its master. He came closer, each step a silent challenge. Defeat, a momentary disruption in the current of fate. The world of men is built on illusions of victory, illusions of finality. But winter always comes, and so do I. He paused, tilting his head. "You hold the memory of this realm. You are the living link to all that has been and ever will be. Join me, and together we will usher this world into a new order." Bran's heartbeat pulsed in his ears. He remembered the stories of how the children of the forest once allied with men to push back the White Walkers. He remembered the swirling conflicts that had threatened to tear the realm apart time and again. He recalled the brief, fragile alliances that men forged when threatened by a common enemy. Could he truly, in good conscience, accept this offer? Yet, a part of him, the part that saw the entire tapestry of existence, recognized the futility of constant war, the constant rebirth of darkness in one form or another. Was there a possibility that by aligning with this ancient power, he could shape a gentler outcome? Or was that delusional hubris? He thought of Sansa, the weight of leadership on her shoulders. He thought of Arya, forging her own path in uncharted lands, of Jon wandering with a battered heart, seeking some elusive peace. He thought of Samwell Tarly in Old Town, learning from books and scrolls, trying to decipher the past in order to protect the future. And then he thought of the land itself, burdened by centuries of conflict. He felt a stirring within, as though the old gods themselves whispered, "We cannot guide you here. This is your choice." Bran took a step onto the ice. It was unsteady under his boots, but he pressed on, one step, then another, each movement accompanied by the protests of cracking ice. He approached the Night King until they stood but an arm's length apart. The difference between them was so stark. One draped in furs and leathers, eyes that carried the warmth of a mortal soul mixed with the wisdom of countless memories. The other rigid, unbreathing, a vessel of cold might that transcended life and death. "What happens if I say no?" Bran asked, voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "You know what happens," the Night King's silent voice answered. "I will rise again. Another war, another slaughter, another cycle of men pretending they can vanquish the darkness for good. Why repeat the dance when you could reshape it?" For a moment, everything went still. Bran felt a single droplet of icy water slide down his cheek, or perhaps it was a tear. He closed his eyes, and in that instant he saw the full vision of what acceptance meant. A world in the grip of eternal winter, but perhaps under his influence, a more measured guidance, or so he desperately hoped. Where once the dead had marched without mercy, perhaps now they would march with purpose, a twisted logic that might bring a new equilibrium. And if not, if it all fell to ruin, then at least it would be a different ruin, one where the cyclical suffering of so many might find release. He wondered if this was rationalization, or if some ancient cosmic plan was at work. And then, in a hush that echoed across the emptiness of the polar dawn, he said one word, yes. The transformation was immediate, though it did not happen in the way Bran might have expected. The Night King reached out a hand of ice. Bran hesitated, but then allowed the Night King's palm to touch his chest, just above the heart. The cold was so profound it felt like a burning brand. Bran let out a gasp, his breath escaping in a cloud of vapor. For a heartbeat, he felt his legs give out and began to collapse. But the Night King's hand pulled him upright, supporting him with inhuman strength. A swirl of energy, of ancient magic, coursed between them. A torrent of voices, memories, and unimaginable cold. Ghost snarled, bounding forward. But then something froze him in place, as if an invisible barrier had been raised. He scratched at the ice beneath his paws, howling, his red eyes fixed on Bran. Bran's vision dimmed, replaced by an all-encompassing whiteness. He was everywhere at once. In the wings of ravens skimming over the snowy plains, in the roots of weirwoods that reached deep into the earth, in the howling wind that whipped across the tundra. He felt the lines of fate tangling and untangling. And then he saw a new reality. The dead rising again, not mindless puppets, but an army that recognized him. In his mind, the Night King's presence loomed, guiding him, tethering him to this new power. Bran felt his heart slow, felt his blood congeal with the creeping chill. He tried to breathe, found he no longer needed to in the same way. 1,000 images flashed. His mother's smile, Hodder's sacrifice, the fall that took his legs, the chaos of war, dragons lighting the sky with fire. The moment Arya ended the Night King's first campaign, all of it slid past him like sand through an hourglass. He felt a deep sorrow, but also an overwhelming sense of omniscience, as though he had transcended the constraints of life. Was this liberation or damnation? When the whiteness receded, he stood upright on the ice, no longer trembling. He looked at the Night King, and for the first time, he sensed a flicker of something in those icy eyes, recognition, acceptance, or perhaps triumph. Bran's once-living flesh carried a new pallor, as if the flush of blood had left him. There was no searing pain now, only an eerie numbness, a sense that the wind and snow were part of him. He glanced down at his hands. The faintest aura of cold radiated from them. He was neither the boy he had been, nor the man he had become, but something in between, something that stood at the crossroads of memory and winter. In the hush, Ghost whined again, uncertain, his tail tucked. Bran reached out to him, but the dire wolf recoiled, ears flattened. The animal sensed that Bran was changed. His scent was no longer comforting or familiar. It reeked of the grave, of centuries-old frost. Ghost let out a sorrowful howl that echoed among the still trees. Slowly, the Night King turned away. Bran felt a silent tug, beckoning him to follow, deeper into the forest. In the distance, shapes moved among the trees, white walkers, their pale blades glinting. And behind them, a stirring in the snow as corpses, long frozen beasts, and half-buried wights rose to heed the call. This time, the army did not lurch forward with mindless hunger. They assembled in eerie silence, an orderly legion waiting for the signal of their new commander. No single consciousness presided but two merged forces, the Night King and the being that was Bran Stark. Together, they projected an influence that spanned miles. The living creatures of the forest scurried away, hearts pounding in primal terror. In that moment, the bond between them solidified, and Bran saw the truth of the Night King's plan. With Bran's gift of vision, the undead horde could be directed with uncanny precision. The illusions of separation between the living and the dead grew thinner as Bran extended his senses. He could see beyond the horizon, beyond the mountains, down into the farmlands of the Gift, past the repaired segments of the wall, and into the heart of Winterfell. His mind touched upon Sansa's presence, like a warm glow in an otherwise darkened mosaic. He felt a pang of regret, but was it truly regret, or just a distant echo of what regret should feel like? She was inside the Great Hall, conferring with advisors, no doubt worried about him. But now he realized no one could stop what was coming. He turned his gaze north again, letting that newly fused power surge. He sensed something else too, something that spanned the continents, a cosmic shift. It was as if the storms themselves had been given new purpose. The horizon darkened with roiling clouds. The wind's howl became a baleful lament that carried across the landscape. Snow began to fall thicker, heavier, with unnatural persistence. Winter was no longer a season. It was an entity, a malevolent force, and it had found its champion in Bran Stark. He and the Night King set forth across the wilderness. Wherever they went, the cold deepened, and the undead followed in throngs. Some wore tattered leathers, some were the animated bones of beasts, some the fallen from past battles whose corpses were never given proper burials. As they traveled, they swelled in number, raising every creature that lay beneath the snow. Their first destination was the Wall. The same magic that prevented the dead from crossing had been significantly weakened when the wall was damaged, and now with Bran's presence. He who had once been the holder of living memory, who had been allowed through the wall unmolested, that ward shattered. At Castle Black, the few remaining Night's Watch who had not deserted raised the alarm. Horn blasts echoed across the frozen ramparts. The men peered out into the swirling whiteness, and what they saw made their blood run cold. A vast host of the dead marching under an unyielding blizzard. At the vanguard walked two figures, one garbed in black ice, the other a gaunt youth in furs, his eyes distant and pale. For a fleeting moment, the men thought to see if this youth might be a survivor or a hostage, but then they noticed the aura of death clinging to him as strongly as to the tall figure at his side. There was no question. This was an invasion by the endless winter itself. Torches flared, arrows were loosed, men bellowed for reinforcements. Ghost, uncertain but compelled to remain, charged ahead, a single white direwolf bounding through the snow with terrifying ferocity. But the whites were too numerous. They met the Night's Watch at the gates, and in a flurry of shrieks and clashing steel, the defenders fell. Some tried valiantly to hold the walls, but the cold invaded their limbs, turned their swords brittle, and their hearts to lead. The wind carried a darkness that snuffed out fires. The shadows of death swept over them, and they collapsed in the drifts. Moments later, their eyes glowed a frosty blue, and they stood again, thralls to the new masters of the long night. Bran watched this without a flicker of emotion. He sensed the final heartbeat of each man as they died, and then felt his essence move among them, animating their corpses. He should have wept, but the tears would not come. All he felt was a strange inevitability, as if this was the realm's fate, written long ago in the roots of the weirwoods. He caught sight of Ghost as the wolf disappeared beneath a throng of whites. The direwolf fought savagely, yelping, snapping, pouncing. For a moment, Bran felt a pang that threatened to crack through the cold shell around him. He reached out mentally, wanting to save Ghost, to spare him, But the tide of undead pressed in, and ghosts' howls turned into silence. Bran sensed the direwolf's spirit flicker and depart, lost to the swirl of darkness and drifting snow. It was done. With Castle Black fallen, the endless winter poured through the breach. A gloom fell upon the north like never before. Ravens took flight, carrying news of doom. But as the storm spread, even the ravens struggled to navigate the sky. Some sense of natural order was undone. Animals fled south. Men barricaded themselves behind walls. But the cold seeped in, unstoppable. Bran and the Night King made no haste, for time belonged to them. An avalanche of frost and shadows rolled across the land, burying hamlets, fields, forests. Rivers froze solid. Harvests withered. The darkness of a permanent storm hid the sun. Day and night blurred into an endless twilight. Snowdrifts grew into mountains, roads vanished, and the living retreated to any stronghold that might withstand the cold. At Winterfell, Sansa realized what was happening in horrifying increments. Scouts who managed to survive the relentless storms returned with frozen limbs, whispering tales of the undead moving in ranks, of a second coming of the Night King. They reported glimpses of a young man riding at the Night King's side, a young man with dark hair, with a face like Bran Stark's. Panic gnawed at Sansa's heart. She refused to believe it at first, but the reports continued, each more unsettling than the last. She convened with what remained of her bannermen, her eyes fierce. "We must hold Winterfell," she declared, remembering the last time they had done so. But the situation was worse now. Their stores of food would not last through an eternal winter, and they had no dragons this time. Daenerys was gone, her dragons scattered or dead. Arya and Jon were far away, possibly out of reach. Still, Sansa was not one to give up. She fortified the castle, called upon any allies in the south who would heed her messages, though she feared the roads were impassable. She drilled the men in the use of dragonglass weapons and had the blacksmiths forge what little Valyrian steel they had into arrowheads and swords. Yet a sinking feeling told her that all these efforts might be in vain. This was not the same conflict they had faced before. There would be no last-minute miracle. The cold itself was now an enemy of monstrous proportions, sapping morale, weakening bodies. Crops had already failed. Famine was on the doorstep, and the unstoppable horde of the undead marched ever closer. Days bled into nights, nights into day, but the sun was a dim, gray orb behind a perpetual layer of freezing clouds. People started calling it the White Dusk, because it seemed as though the realm was locked in a twilight. Every dawn looked like dusk, and every dusk was indistinguishable from the dead of night. When at last the undead host arrived at Winterfell's doorstep, it was a sight that struck terror into even the bravest hearts. The armies of whites stretched across the horizon, rank upon rank of silent figures stirring in the swirling snow. At their head stood the Night King, an imposing silhouette crowned with spires of frost, and beside him Bran Stark, pallid, eyes rimmed with ice, wearing a cloak of white fur. His presence was a blasphemy against all that Winterfell stood for, all the Starks had sacrificed to protect. Yet there he was, the last male heir of Ned Stark, returned as a harbinger of the endless winter. Sansa stood upon the ramparts, the wind lashing her red hair around her face. She would not flinch. Despite the cold that gnawed at her bones, her resolve remained as strong as Valyrian steel. She scanned the mass of the undead, and when she saw Bran's face, her breath caught in her throat. He was undeniably changed, pale as the snow, radiating a dreadful calm. Yet behind that mask of ice, she caught a glimmer of something. Could it be doubt? Or was that only her wishful thinking? Her eyes stung with tears that froze on her lashes. She remembered the boy who had once clung to her hand in the corridors, who dreamed of knights and heroes, who soared in the sky in his imagination. She remembered how proud their parents were of him. And now he stood with the greatest evil the North had ever known. Sansa forced herself to speak, her voice carrying over the walls, echoing in the hush. "Bran, hear me. Whatever hold this creature has on you, you are still a Stark of Winterfell." Her words faltered for a moment, but she pressed on. "I beg you, If there is any part of you that remembers who you are, stand down. End this before more blood is spilled. Bran heard her voice. It cut through the swirling illusions of frost and memory. For an instant, his chest tightened. The part of him that was still Bran Stark stirred, flickering like a candle in a snowstorm. Visions of days past flashed through his mind. Sansa, stoic and cunning, forging alliances to reclaim Winterfell. Arya, swift and deadly, hugging him upon their reunion. Jon stooping to embrace him, his mother's arms around him when he was small, tucking him into bed on cold nights. He felt a tug of longing. But then the pall of the infinite winter reasserted itself. The Night King's presence loomed in his mind, a glacier of unyielding purpose. The illusions of mortal love and loyalty are fleeting, it seemed to whisper. The cycle demands closure. You are beyond them now. Bran lifted a hand. The signal was clear. The undead surged forward, a wave of whiteness that crashed against Winterfell's walls. Sansa turned away, eyes bleak, and gave the order for her archers to loose. The defenders fought valiantly, raining dragonglass-dipped arrows upon the dead, slicing them down with steel. But each wight that fell was replaced by two more. The cold battered at their walls, forming sheets of ice that threatened to crack the ramparts. Men slipped, tumbled into the throng, and rose again as part of the undead legion. The sound of steel on ice was deafening, accompanied by the ghastly wails of those who realized the futility of their stand. Amid the chaos, Bran advanced, the icy wind swirling about him. He reached the gates, raised both hands. A burst of blue energy pulsed outward, freezing the iron in seconds, causing it to splinter. With a thunderous crash, the gates collapsed inward. The defenders scrambled to form a new line, but it was no use. The horde poured in. Sansa was pulled away by her guards, but she resisted, refusing to leave. She had sworn she would not abandon Winterfell again. She shouted orders, but the swirl of the fight rendered them half-heard. In the courtyard, while men and women battled the relentless undead, a confrontation took shape. Sansa, brandishing a Valyrian steel dagger with unsteady hands, standing face to face with her brother. For a moment, neither moved. The storm raged around them. Overhead, crows, twisted by cold or illusions, circled, cawing ominously. Bran looked upon Sansa with the detachment of a creature that no longer felt the normal bonds of blood. She was an obstacle, a memory from a life he had forsaken for a power so vast and ancient. "Bran," she pleaded, voice raw, "we can find another way. Together we can save the North without killing everyone. You used to care. You used to." His expression did not change, but something in his eyes flickered. Without a word, he lifted a hand. A swirl of magic began to crystallize the air around her, the chill penetrating her cloak. Her lips turned blue as she tried to speak, but the cold robbed her breath. She staggered, sinking to her knees, the dagger slipping from her grasp. Bran stood over her, the swirling wind whipping his hair and cloak. Icicles formed on her lashes. In that moment, had he been fully the Night King's thrall, he might have struck her dead. But the shard of Bran Stark that still flickered within him was not entirely extinguished, and instead of delivering a fatal blow, he hesitated. In that heartbeat, Sansa's guard collided with him, trying to force him away, but a wave of cold flung them back as if they weighed nothing. Sansa collapsed in the snow, barely able to move. Bran's magic parted the whites around her, as though shielding her from the final blow. He turned, leaving her alive but too frozen to continue the fight, perhaps the last mercy he could offer as Winterfell fell to the undead. The battle ended swiftly after that. The living were overwhelmed. Some fled into the crypts, seeking shelter behind stone walls, but the unstoppable cold soon penetrated those depths. Any who survived would only delay the inevitable. Winterfell was consumed in ice and quiet. The once proud fortress, seat of House Stark, was now a frozen mausoleum. Southward the endless winter marched, swallowing Moat Cailin, ravaging the twins, turning the Green Fork into a solid span of ice. News reached King's Landing in broken fragments. Tyrion Lannister, who served on the council, was one of the first to grasp the gravity of the threat. He had seen the dead before, had traveled north on that doomed expedition to prove the undead's existence to Cersei. He had thought the threat ended when the Night King was destroyed. How could such a horror return? Word that Bran Stark himself was leading the apocalypse stunned him. He recalled their final meeting, the quiet confidence Bran exuded, the wise but distant composure. Had they all underestimated him? In King's Landing, panic spread like wildfire. Refugees from the north poured in, telling tales of unstoppable cold, of an ice storm that swallowed entire armies. The southern lords bickered, some wanting to flee across the narrow sea. Others demanded a last stand in the capital. Civilians looked to the sky for dragons that would never come. The city's bells tolled mournfully, day and night. Snow began falling in the Crownlands, a sight not seen in many years. The people huddled in taverns and homes, burning everything flammable to ward off the creeping frost. But the temperature dropped day by day, until the Blackwater Bay began to freeze at the edges, and the once balmy coasts of Dorne saw flurries swirling around the dunes. Tyrion assembled what was left of the council. Ser Bronn of the Blackwater, now Lord of Highgarden, arrived with a weary retinue. Lord Gendry Baratheon came from Storm's End, jaw set in grim determination. A few others trickled in. Their discussions were frantic. Some whispered that they should try to parley with the undead king. But the question was, who would they even address, the Night King who never spoke or Bran Stark whose mind might be lost? Tyrion, pacing in the council chamber, thought of every possible strategy. He recalled how Samwell Tarly had mentioned spells of binding and illusions from old texts in the Citadel. But Sam was not here, and no one was certain where he might be. Even if they had such spells, would it matter? The living had exhausted nearly all their resources in the previous war. The Targaryen dragons were gone. The alliances were fractured. The realm was just beginning to heal from the last cataclysm. And now, as if the gods themselves had decided men were unworthy, the final winter was upon them. Determined not to go down without a fight, Tyrion ordered the forging of new dragonglass weapons, the reinforcement of the city's walls, and the preparation of wildfire caches, though he shuddered at the memory of how wildfire had ravaged King's Landing before. Still, in desperation, they resorted to desperate measures. Despite their efforts, morale was dismal. The skies grew darker each day as the storm front approached from the north, twisting the heavens into a gray swirl that never parted. Word reached them that the undead host had taken the neck with minimal resistance, that White Harbor was in ruins. Thousands died from the cold before the Whites even arrived. Some tried to run, but where could they go? As the final push came upon King's Landing, Tyrion found himself atop the battlements, looking out at an ocean of white. The undead horde sprawled from horizon to horizon, the lines broken only by the silhouettes of White Walkers and massive undead beasts. Overhead, black shapes circled, wyverns or giant ravens, mutated by dark magic, it seemed. The wind howled down from the north, carrying stinging sleet. Tyrion swallowed his fear. He had faced dragons before, had negotiated with the tyrant's cause. The city's fortress fell with minimal bloodshed. Again, Daenerys established a council and left behind part of her force to ensure peace. Step by step, she was forging a belt of free territories, not as an empress, but as a revered and sometimes feared protector. Then came Meereen, the city that had once been her capital, the place she had ruled before sailing to Westeros. She had memories of triumph and heartbreak there. The fighting pits, the sons of the Harpy, the uneasy alliances. Dario Naharis had been left in charge, but he had lacked the authority and the broader strategy to keep the city free of turmoil. Rumor said that several factions had battled for control since. Some supported Daenerys' old reforms, while others wanted a return to tradition. Dario had eventually been overthrown, exiled, or perhaps even killed. No one was certain. As Daenerys approached, she felt a knot of tension in her chest. This city had once been her greatest test, and she had left it behind to chase what she believed was her destiny in Westeros. Perhaps this was where her redemption would face its strongest reckoning. She camped outside the city walls, sending word that Daenerys Stormborn had returned and demanded a parley with whoever claimed authority inside. At first, there was no response, as if the city's factions did not believe or could not agree on how to address her. Several days passed with no official word, only frightened refugees slipping out in the night, whispering that warlords and old slaver families were locked in stalemate. Finally, a delegation emerged. A group of men and women in worn finery, flanked by scowling guards. They approached Daenerys' camp uncertainly. The air was tense, dusty with the desert wind. Daenerys greeted them calmly, wearing simple riding leathers and no crown, though she carried herself with quiet authority. Drogon loomed behind her, the living threat that had once burned her enemies to ash. The delegates studied her as if trying to measure this resurrected queen against their memories and rumors. One man with a scar across his cheek introduced himself as Sabar Zolorak, a distant cousin of Hisdar Zolorak, whom Daenerys had once briefly married for peace. Sabar explained that the city was ruled in name by a council of old families, but chaos reigned in practice. Gangs roamed the streets. Slavery had begun creeping back, disguised as indentured contracts. No single faction had gained complete control. Many Myrinese remembered Daenerys fondly, but others blamed her for leaving them to this fate. Sabar said that if she wished to restore order, she might find some support among the common folk, but the old families would resist any attempt to strip them of their wealth and status. They were suspicious of her motives and terrified of the destruction she might unleash with her dragon. Daenerys listened, sorrow rising in her heart. She recalled the nights she had spent trying to negotiate peace between freed slaves and the old families, the bloody attacks by the Sons of the Harpy, the fragile alliances. Now it seemed all that had unraveled. She remembered Dario's confident grin when she left him in charge, how he assured her he would keep the peace. She wondered if he had died trying, or if he had abandoned Meereen for greener pastures. Guilt weighed on her again. She told the delegation that she would not punish those who had tried to rule in her absence, provided they recognized that slavery was illegal. She wanted a peaceful resolution. She was not here for vengeance, but she would not condone a return to chains. The delegates eyed Drogon nervously, some bowing and scraping, others pressing for more details. Daenerys maintained that she would enter Meereen in peace if the city welcomed her, but if they barred her, she would force her way in. She did not want a battle, but she would not shy from it. Negotiations dragged out over the next several days. Daenerys used the time to speak directly with refugees and travelers in and out of Meereen's gates, gleaning a clearer picture of the chaos within. Finally, unrest in the city boiled over. One night, a group of freed slaves within the walls staged an uprising, calling Daenerys' name, chanting that she had returned from the dead to restore true freedom. City guards loyal to the old families tried to crush the revolt, and fighting spread through several districts. By dawn, a portion of the walls was held by the rebels, who signaled Daenerys to come. Fearing a repeat of the devastation she had caused in the past, Daenerys resolved to move carefully, but move she did. She led her followers forward, converging on the city's gate. Confronted by a newly formed militia of old family troops, she demanded they step aside or face the dragon's wrath. Many laid down their arms rather than test Drogon's flames. Entering Meereen felt surreal. The streets where she had once been carried in a palanquin as queen were scarred by fighting. Graffiti on the walls depicted her as a mother figure to some, a demon to others. Fire smoldered in the distance where pockets of violence still flared. She pressed forward, ensuring her people did not engage in looting or revenge. Freed folk joined her procession, cheering and weeping. Some flung themselves at her feet, calling her Mysa, mother, queen, savior. Once, she had reveled in such adoration. Now she felt its weight. What if she failed them again? She met with representatives of the council that had been trying to govern Meereen. They were harried and uncertain. Some of them once supported her rule, others had been lukewarm, but now they all bowed under the pressure. She announced that she would oversee the establishment of a new council, representing freed folk and moderate old families willing to swear a binding oath never to engage in slavery again. She demanded that warlords controlling certain districts lay down their arms, or she would personally see them brought to justice. Her voice carried the steely edge of a woman who had known conquest and redemption. Yet she did not threaten to burn the city, only to remove those who refused to accept a slave-free Meereen. Over the next weeks, battles were fought in the slums and wealthier areas alike. Small factions that refused to yield attacked Daenerys' followers. In each skirmish, she tried to minimize bloodshed by offering clemency to those who surrendered. Some did, some did not. She lost good people in the fighting, and each death weighed on her. But she did not let that sorrow turn into the cold fury that once consumed her. Slowly, order reemerged. Freed folk rallied behind Daenerys. Some old family houses acquiesced, seeing that she was unstoppable. A smaller group attempted to assassinate her, but Drogon's heightened senses alerted Daenerys in time for her to avoid the trap. It was a grueling process, but finally, Meereen was wrested from chaos. Daenerys stood in the Grand Pyramid once more, though she refused to claim the lofty throne at its summit. Instead, she convened daily meetings in a spacious hall where newly appointed council members debated how to rebuild. She insisted that economic growth must not rely on enslaved labor. She urged them to establish fair trade routes with Yunkai and Astapor, now also slave-free under allied councils. Representatives from those cities arrived, forging the beginnings of a confederation of free states in Slavers Bay. No longer named Slavers Bay, but Freedmen's Bay, a symbolic gesture of unity. Daenerys did not claim to be queen of these states, but each recognized her as their protector and guide. Drogon remained a reminder of her power, though she was far more reluctant to unleash his flame than before. In time, Daenerys began to ponder Westeros again. While she mended the society she had once freed, she also learned from incoming travelers that King Bran Stark ruled from King's Landing, presiding over a kingdom seeking to heal from the devastations of war. Sansa Stark was queen in the north, the Iron Islands maintained a degree of autonomy, and the Seven Kingdoms were no longer truly seven in number. Reports suggested that peace was tenuous but holding. Few in Westeros knew that Daenerys had returned, though rumors might have slipped across the sea by now. She wondered how Jon Snow lived with himself, after plunging a knife into her heart. She wondered if Tyrion Lannister still served as hand. Anger flickered in her chest, but she tried to quell it. The brand of betrayal still stung, but she recognized that her actions in King's Landing had left them little choice. She had been out of control, though she refused to believe that killing her had been the only option. Yet she was alive, and that changed everything. Melisandre, ever watchful, encouraged her to consider the next steps carefully. "You have built something remarkable here," the priestess observed one evening while the two stood on a balcony overlooking Meereen. "These free cities, united. It may be the start of a true break in the cycle. Are you content to remain and guard this land from the slavers? Or is your destiny to return to Westeros and see the prophecy to its end?" Daenerys stared into the night sky. The memory of the Iron Throne, melted into slag, flickered across her mind's eye. "I cannot ignore Westeros," she said softly. "I am Targaryen by blood. I still believe my family's legacy is tied to that land. But I will not arrive as an invader bent on conquest this time, not unless the people cry out for a change. If King Bran is if the realm thrives under him, I have no wish to soak it in blood again. I might go there simply to face my past, to show them that I live, that I have changed. Perhaps I owe it to them, and to myself." Melisandre's faint smile caught the moonlight. "There is wisdom in that, but prepare yourself for how they may react. Some will hate and fear you for what you did. Others may see you as an omen. You have supporters still, perhaps scattered or silent, but once they know you live, you may find yourself pulled into war again, whether you will it or not." Daenerys nodded. She was no stranger to the unwelcome demands of power. "Then I must be ready. I will not become a butcher, but I will not allow anyone to butcher me or my people either." For another year, she worked tirelessly in the east. Freedman's Bay became a stable confederation of 3 city-states, Yunkai, Astapor, and Mirin, cooperating under newly formed councils, each city forging agreements to prevent the return of slavery. Daenerys advised them, stepping in when unscrupulous factions tried to resurface. She coordinated with the Red Temple, who provided some moral authority against slavery, framing it as a blasphemy against Lawler. Though Daenerys did not wish to impose a theocracy, the Red Temple's influence helped keep the slaver aristocracy at bay. Other nearby cities took note. Some reduced their involvement in the slave trade to avoid provoking Daenerys. Her name carried weight again, but this time less as a conquering warlord and more as a liberator who actually tried to maintain the peace. Finally, satisfied that Freedman's Bay was strong enough to stand on its own, Daenerys prepared to sail back to Westeros. She had decided it was time. She had some measure of peace in her soul for what she had accomplished in the East, but she knew the ghosts of her past in Westeros would never rest unless she faced them. Her supporters were divided on the decision. Many believed she should remain, that her presence was needed to keep the new confederation stable. Others insisted that her rightful throne was in Westeros, that her people in Freedman's Bay would flourish, but she must claim the destiny for which she was apparently resurrected. Daenerys's mind was made up, though. She would cross the narrow sea once more, not with a massive army but with a carefully chosen retinue, a detachment of loyal soldiers, freedmen who volunteered, and some Red Temple priests. Drogon, of course, would bear her above the waves. A small fleet of ships would carry the rest. As she stood on the Myrinese docks, the wind from the ocean whipping her silver-gold hair, she gazed at the horizon. She remembered standing at a similar vantage years before, about to sail west with her armies, full of fire and ambition. This time, her heart was steadier. She was older in spirit, even if only a few years had passed. She had tasted ultimate victory and ultimate defeat, soared to the heights of power only to die and be reborn. She was no longer the same Daenerys Targaryen, but she was still the blood of the dragon, and the dragon was not meant to be caged forever. Melisandre stood beside her, still frail but upright, the red gemstone at her throat pulsing faintly. Do you truly intend to arrive in peace? What if they attack on sight? They do not know the changed heart that lies within you. They may see only the queen who brought destruction. Daenerys lifted her chin, her eyes alight with resolution. Then I will hold my fire. I will offer them my hand, not my fist. But if they strike me down, so be it. I have already died once for my mistakes. The Red Priestess's eyes flickered. Then may Lawler watch over us both. Daenerys mounted Drogon, the black dragon scales shimmering in the sun, while her chosen companions boarded the ships. The sails bore no sigil but a red and black design symbolizing the flame of rebirth rather than the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. It felt fitting, a new banner for a queen who had walked through death's door. As the anchors were weighed and the ships drifted from the harbor, thousands of freed people stood along the docks, cheering her name, lifting torches in a symbolic farewell. Daenerys felt tears sting her eyes. This was not the roar of a people demanding war. It was the farewell of those who believed in her. She raised a hand in silent acknowledgement, then spurred Drogon to ascend into the bright sky, leading the way across the sea. The voyage was a testament to her changed fortunes. Once, she had carried tens of thousands across the narrow sea in a grand fleet. Now, she had only a handful of vessels, but each was manned by devoted souls who had chosen to follow her not out of fear or for the promise of loot, but because they believed in her cause. The crossing was swift under favorable winds. They passed merchant ships, some of which gave them a wide berth upon seeing the dragon overhead. Daenerys wondered what rumors would outrun them in Westeros, that the Dragon Queen lived again, come to claim the throne she had lost. When finally the coast of Dorne came into view, Daenerys let Drogon fly ahead to scout. She knew that Dorne had declared for King Bran as part of the realm's reorganization, though the Martells or their successors might still hold some measure of autonomy. She decided not to land in the capital city of Sunspear immediately, wary of startling them into a hostile response. Instead, she guided the fleet toward a more secluded inlet. There, her people could disembark and rest, while she decided how to make her presence known. It was strange to set foot on the soil of Westeros again, to feel the desert wind of Dorne on her face. Memories of the last time she was here flooded her. Alliances with Ilaria Sand and the Sand Snakes, all of which had ended in blood and betrayal. She tried to keep her mind focused on the present. She was not here for vengeance or conquest, but for truth and reconciliation, if such a thing was even possible. A small village huddled some miles inland. Daenerys, accompanied by a few of her closest advisors and with Drogon perched discreetly behind a hill, approached on foot. The villagers looked upon her party with surprise and apprehension. They recognized the foreign garments, the sight of red temple priests, and the presence of armed men. But no one expected to see Daenerys Targaryen herself alive. Some dropped to their knees in fear, babbling about the Dragon Queen. Daenerys gently asked them to rise, assuring them she meant no harm. It took time to calm them, to explain that she only wanted news of the realm's state. Gradually, a handful of braver souls came forward, acknowledging they had heard rumors that a new power had risen in Freedman's Bay, that the Dragon Queen had somehow returned. Daenerys purchased supplies from them, paying with coin minted in Essos, and she gleaned what information she could. She learned that King Bran's rule had been mostly peaceful, but tensions existed with the Iron Islands, and some lords resented the northern independence. The village folk were uncertain how they felt about a Targaryen queen's return. They remembered the Mad King's atrocities only through old stories, and they recalled that Daenerys once promised to break the wheel. But they also remembered the horror stories of King's Landing's burning. Daenerys tried to dispel their fears without glossing over the truth. She admitted she had made mistakes. She hoped that might inspire some measure of trust. Over the next days, Daenerys sent riders bearing messages to Sunspear and other major seats in Dorne, announcing her peaceful arrival. She wished to meet with any southern lords who were willing to hear her. Her letters explained that she was not claiming the throne or seeking war, but returning to Westeros to atone and to determine how she might help the realm. She signed each missive simply as Daenerys Stormborn, called the Breaker of Chains. The responses were cautious. Some southern lords refused to meet her, perhaps fearing condemnation from King Bran if they showed hospitality to the dethroned queen. Others expressed curiosity, offering to speak under safe conduct. Finally, a representative from House Martell, a distant cousin of the old line, who had emerged after the Sand Snake's downfall, invited her to Sunspear under a banner of truce. Daenerys accepted. She left the bulk of her followers camped at the inlet, taking only a small retinue. Drogon flew overhead, a silent guardian. The approach to Sunspear was tense. Dornish archers lined the walls, watchful. The gates opened just enough to admit Daenerys and her companions. She rode in, wearing simple attire, no crown, no great display of finery. She saw the wariness in the guards' eyes, but also a flicker of awe at the black dragon circling above. Inside the castle's courtyard, the Prince of Dorne awaited her, flanked by advisors. He was a man with olive skin and a somber mien, perhaps in his 40s, introduced as Lord Corran Martell. He greeted Daenerys with measured politeness, calling her Your Grace, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders. She inclined her head respectfully. My lord, thank you for agreeing to meet. I know my presence here may be unsettling. He studied her, as if trying to parse the woman behind the legend. You understand if I have concerns. The realm still speaks of what happened in King's Landing. The ashes remain. Yet here you stand, alive, rumored to have come back from the grave. What is it you want, truly? She spoke frankly. I do not come to raise an army against King Bran. I come to see if this realm is as peaceful and just as I hoped it would be. If it is, then perhaps my work is done. If there is suffering that cries out for justice, then I will do what I can without unleashing another war. Believe me or not, that is my truth. Lord Corran nodded slowly. And if the realm's lords refuse to accept your presence? If they view you as a threat, will you mount Drogon and burn them? The old Daenerys might have bristled in anger. Now she only let out a breath. No, I have learned that fire and blood do not sow lasting peace. But neither will I be led to a slaughter. If they attempt to,